Today we are welcoming Henry Hale, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs, and also Director of a version of CREASE, of the Area Studies Center devoted to Russia, Eastern Europe, and Eurasia at George Washington University in D.C. Professor Hale has taught for the last 5 years at GW. He was at Indiana University, our regional neighbor before that. He earned a PhD at Harvard, where he worked with Tim Colton, among others, who's now a frequent co-author of his on articles, essays, book chapters. Henry's written both collaboratively, as that suggests, and solo, and very widely. He's a specialist on post-Soviet politics, in particular on questions of parties, machine politics, movements, elections, ethnicity, leadership, in Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Bashkortostan. How's that for a short list? It's a long list, to name just some of the leading locations and themes. He has 3 books to his credit, including the prize-winning Why Not Parties in Russia, which was published in 2006. In terms, in other words, both of breadth and of insight, I think it's fair to characterize him as a rising star, or maybe a star fully born in the field of post-Soviet politics and Russian politics, and we're really happy to have him here. It's especially gratifying to welcome Henry to Michigan as an exemplar, I would suggest, of a particular generation of scholars and of scholarship on the understanding of politics in Russia and the former Soviet Union. He belongs to the first generation trained after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Actually, he's trained during the collapse of the Soviet Union and beyond, with his BA in 1988 and an MA in 1990, and has shown what inventive and curious minds could do in making sense of a Russia that was very different, at least in some ways, from what had come before, by using new sources, asking new questions, using new methods. I, in fact, first met him more than 20 years ago. You may not believe that, given our mutual boyish good looks. On my own first extended stay in the Soviet Union. It was still the Soviet Union. There was not a single McDonald's in Moscow the summer that we were at Moscow Finance Institute together. I moved on more or less to stay to places south, Uzbekistan and neighboring areas, where the weather was better and the melons and lamb tastier. He came with me sometimes to the south, at least metaphorically, that is, exploring across borders in the newly instantiated multiplicity of countries that replaced the former Soviet Union, but he also kept going back to Russia. And so he's experienced and chronicled and analyzed and helped explain many of the developments that have occurred since, which means he's able to offer broad reflections about developments across this region as a whole, as you'll see through the heading of his topic for the talk today. Thinking about ways in which there are variations, but also kernels of common trajectories and developments across the space of Eurasia. The lecture today in which he'll explore those notions is Democracy, Autocracy, and Revolution in Post-Soviet Eurasia. Professor Hale.
Normally I would thank Doug for such a generous introduction, but I'm worried that after that introduction, the talk is bound to be disappointing. But I'll try to do my best. But no, thank you very much for that and for the kind invitation. I'll just say at the outset that the presentation is based on an ongoing research project, and it's ultimately, hopefully, going to result in a book manuscript. So I've conducted most of the field work for it. Now it's just a process of writing it up and trying to get the argument right and maybe doing some supplemental research. So that is by way of saying that your feedback at this stage will be very, very useful for me, as well as interesting. So the project starts with the observation that next year will be the 20th anniversary of the independence of the post-Soviet states. This year is already the 20th anniversary of the first contested elections at the republic level of the former Soviet states. And one of the things that's interesting to me as a comparative political scientist is the great diversity of outcomes that we see in terms of the kind of regime that has developed in the different locations. So, on one extreme in the post-Soviet space, you have the Baltic countries, maybe Lithuania among them being the more successful in the European Union, generally considered by ratings to be a stable democracy. Whereas on the other extreme, one would probably put Turkmenistan, where you still have golden statues, rotating to face the sun of at least the former dictator, but clear cults of personality and a very harsh authoritarian regime. But on the other hand, we've also seen not just diversity, but a lot of change. There's been, in fact, a great deal of dynamism in terms of how the regimes have developed in the region. And in fact, one of the things that interests me is that this change has seemed to take analysts on what one might call a roller coaster ride of expectations. There was initially the democratization of the early 1990s, collapse of communism, the breakup of the Soviet Union. There was a broad expectation among analysts that democracy had won and that there'd probably be some bumps in the road, but eventually we're going to be seeing more democratic outcomes. Soon, however, you started to see a trend in the other direction, with more and more states moving away from democracy, taking on more authoritarian elements, especially in the late 1990s and early 2000s, perhaps symbolized best for most Westerners with the rise of Putin, President Putin in Russia. And just when the consensus seemed to be developing that, in fact, we're just moving back towards authoritarianism, you had the wave of the so-called colored revolutions hit the region. In 2003 in Georgia, the Rose Revolution, 2004 in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution, 2005, what many call the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. There were talks of this being a set of democratic breakthroughs. On the other hand, interpretation of these events was varied. Maybe the other extreme were analysts, often in Russia, for example, itself, who interpreted these revolutions as nothing more than Western CIA-organized plots, coups d'etat. And in fact, perhaps unsurprisingly, neither extreme turned out to be right. I don't think we can call these democratic breakthroughs because if we look at sort of the immediate outcomes, for example, what happened under the leaders that took power under the slogans of democracy, we find that in Georgia and Kyrgyzstan, for example, elections ultimately came to be judged not free and fair. Violence was used in both of these countries against the opposition. Pressure was restored on media, especially television. And if we look at virtually all of the ratings, polity for the different Freedom House ratings, they almost all indicate that, in fact, these countries became less democratic after their revolutions under the revolutionary leaders than they had been immediately prior to the revolution. So, for example, the nations in transit ratings of Freedom House indicate that. And we see that Kyrgyzstan even wound up succumbing to a new revolution against what the opposition then branded an authoritarian regime, although it wasn't one associated with elections. In Ukraine, however, we do get what looks like to be a different outcome, at least under the people that took power immediately after the Orange Revolution. And in fact, it was only there among the revolutionary countries where elections were judged free and fair. Politics were generally open with strong media diversity and pluralism. Politics were open, and no violence was generally used against the opposition, again, unlike Kyrgyzstan and in Georgia. And if one looks at these Freedom House ratings again, we find that Ukraine is, in fact, during the period between 2005 and 2010, the only country since the Baltic countries in the early 1990s to have broken into that category of fully free. So that to me suggests that this is something interesting and significant. But even so, now that we've seen the revolutionary leaders depart in Kyrgyzstan with the overthrow of Bakiyev, President Bakiyev, in April of this year, and the loss by Yulia Tymoshenko and Viktor Yushchenko in the presidential election in Ukraine in January and February of this year, we see more change. Ukraine seems to be slipping away from this democratic outcome immediately after the revolution. And Kyrgyzstan has just held the freest and fairest election arguably in Central Asia's history, despite having experienced a truly terrible kind of bout of what one might call state failure in the period during April through June with the ethnic violence in Osh. So as a political scientist, I'm led to ask the question, which I think is an interesting one, and that is there any regularity to these developments? Are there patterns about the way that politics has developed in these post-Soviet regions? Again, probably political science instincts lead me to think that there probably is. What I would want to argue, and I'll put forward the case today, is that the diversity and change that we see in the post-Soviet space, in fact, reflects certain regular patterns in how certain kinds of political institutions interact with the pervasive system of patron-client relations that has developed historically in post-communist countries. So I don't mean to say that they're all alike, but I think that there is a certain commonality in terms of a general pervasiveness of patron-client relations that provides an important backdrop, and that much of the dynamism we can see has to do with how certain political institutions interact with that system of patron-client relations. So what do I mean by pervasive patron-client relations? These are terms that it's a term that in other disciplines or in other works is referred to as just clientelism, neo-patrimonialism. The formal definition might be, I borrow from Herbert Kitchelt, a social equilibrium in which political exchange tends to be characterized far more by concrete punishments and rewards meted out to specific individuals, as opposed to broad policies that are meant to that are not targeted at individuals, but treat entire classes of people according to relatively explicit and generalized rules. So it's kind of this personalized politics versus the broad policy making. If we turn to the work of Herbert Kitchelt and some of his co-authors, they characterize the USSR as being characterized by a certain kind of communist system, one that they called patrimonial communism, which is somewhat distinct from different forms of communism in a lot of the other countries of the former Warsaw Pact. And so they see it as a communism that was, had these hierarchies and these forms of patron-client relations that played large roles in Soviet politics. So again, I'll be happy to elaborate on that should you like during the discussion. But I think as I go along, it'll become more concrete what I'm talking about. And at least in this particular context of these pervasive patron-client relations, to a large extent, the patterns that I described at the outset of this talk can be understood as the product of a set of institutions that I've elsewhere called patronal presidentialism. And so what do I mean by patronal presidentialism? Well, in a nutshell, it boils down to a directly elected presidency where at least some real opposition is allowed to compete in presidential elections. And also where the presidency has two key features. So one is that the presidency has significant powers. It's not just a figurehead on, even in the formal documentation in the Constitution, but where the president also wields strong informal powers at the nexus of state and society, in particular where it concerns economy. So again, we can talk about the relationship between formal and informal institutions, but in the interest of moving on, the observation is that most countries of the former Soviet space have in fact had such a system for most of the period since the Soviet Union collapsed, where you had a strong presidency that is strong both in terms of the Constitution as well as in the informal powers that the president wields. And in this context, the key to understanding how the system works, how the political system actually functions, is to understand the logic of collective action that underpins it. So it starts by looking at a category of figures who I would call elites. And elites are basically those people who have a major stake and hence power of some sort in society, that have something to lose, but also have something, they're able to influence outcomes to a significant degree. So these would include regional elites. So in these different systems, governors, prefects in Central Asia, hakims. They might include business elites, especially those that control mass media. And they could also include, what different scholars have called clans or tribes or hordes in Central Asian or some of the other politics of the other countries of the region. They can include bureaucratic elites, media, military, police, and even judicial elites, by which I'm referring to justices in the top courts. So the general point is that in principle, the president and the elites are mutually dependent. So that is, of course, the elites depend on the president for access to resources. The president largely gets to decide who gets access to various types of patronage goods. But I think what's often less well understood is that the president also depends on the elites to carry out his policies or enforce his will. And in almost all cases, it's a he, although not everywhere or exclusively. And so, in principle, you could have a situation where if the elites were able to gang up on a president, they could remove that president successfully. If they just refuse to obey the orders and agree to kind of get rid of this guy. But the elites face a major difficulty in any attempt to do this, in that they have to somehow organize their actions together. One or two of these elites in these countries are not able to take out a president, generally speaking. They have to act collectively in order to do so. But this makes them very vulnerable because a strong presidency in this kind of system, in this kind of clientelistic society where the president has such powerful, not only constitutional powers, but also informal powers, is very well positioned to divide and conquer the elites. And so this can be done in many ways, which we see throughout the region. The elites can be co-opted or blackmailed. And almost anyone is vulnerable to that to some degree. Others can be pressured or punished. Businesses are typically subject to inspections or tax arrears, or their businesses are found to be in violation of fire codes, and they can be pressured in that way. Governors or hakims, if they're appointed, they can simply be fired, or if they're elected, they can have their opposition financed covertly or overtly by the president. Bureaucrats can simply be fired, and again, almost anyone can be arrested or coerced under genuine or trumped-up grounds. But the crucial point is that even this rewarding or punishing of some elites depends on other elites carrying out that rewarding or punishing. And I think this is where the crucial presidential advantage comes in, because the president doesn't have a problem of collective action. The president is, in fact, what one might call an institutionalized focal point for setting the expectations of some elites as to what other elites will do. So kind of where the president points and gives the order is the most likely, it points in the most likely direction that people are going to expect other elites to behave in. And so when the president says punish an elite, people generally expect that the mechanism will work, that other elites will follow the order to punish. And this, therefore, makes it highly unprofitable for an elite to try and initiate opposition to a president. And so the risk of punishment can be very, very high. And so I think it's crucially the president's advantage over every other elite in determining the expectations of other elites that gives the president his power in these kind of systems. And so the result is essentially, I think, and this is a large part of what we see in the history of the post-Soviet space over the last 20 years, is essentially this mechanism producing a large hierarchy, kind of what I've called a single pyramid political system, a single pyramid constructed out of various networks of patron-client relations. And we find the same language that we might use to describe this theoretically used in the local vernacular. So these are referred to as the vertikal vlasti, right? The vertical of power, the pyramida of power, pyramids of power. In American parlance, we might refer to it as one big political machine. And in fact, I think that's a very good analogy for the kinds of political systems that we have formed in the former Soviet space. And so, I think most of the countries of the region can be characterized in this way. Certainly Putin in Russia, especially during the 2000s, Kuchma at the peak of his power around the 1999 presidential election, Askar Akayev in Kyrgyzstan, Eduard Shevardnadze in Georgia, Haydar Aliyev in Azerbaijan as of around 2000, and virtually all of Central Asia since the mid-1990s, with the exception of Kyrgyzstan, which we'll come to. And I think it's also important to note here that in each of these cases, these different elites, they're not unified, right? They have diverse and competing interests. But they're still all united around the president. And so but what they're doing, though, is competing not against the president, but they're competing more for presidential favor. And the president manipulates these divisions in the elite to try and pursue this divide and conquer strategy. And so, I think this is where we see, important divisions in the elite come in. So Ukraine very typically, is characterized as being divided between, a Western-oriented West and a more Russia-oriented East. Kyrgyzstan is divided between a more kind of, a North and a South. The North being traditionally a little more industrial and oriented towards Russia. The South having a large Uzbek population. In Russia, we see divisions between these competing networks. Under Yeltsin, it was Berezovsky and Gusinsky, these oligarchs. Or under Putin, we talk about competition between the St. Petersburg lawyers and liberals versus the Siloviki, the force agents in Russia. And this can also be competition between regional or clan extended networks in, for example, Uzbekistan. And I think that what's particularly interesting about this isn't the fact that you get these single pyramid systems forming, these giant political machines. To me, what the most interesting thing is that this dynamic can change almost completely during points, when points of potential power transfer approach. When elites in the system start to anticipate that the head of this whole apparatus, the president, is going to leave power for one reason or other. And empirically, we see that this happens. For a variety of reasons, leaders decide to leave power, whether it's because they become ill, want to leave politics, or what have you. And in such cases, presidents have a strong tendency to become what we would call lame ducks. And so what does this mean precisely, if we think about it in terms of the logic of collection of action that we were talking about earlier? One thing that this means is that when a president is expected to leave office, the elites in the system that are carrying out the president's orders are forced to start to think of a world in the future when that president is no longer around to give those orders. And this is a world where the president then might not be in a position to punish you if you break ranks now. And so maybe you'll get punished, but the chance increases that, well, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll be able to get away with it because who knows what's going to come after the president. And that is the president effectively stops becoming the sole determiner of elite expectations as to other elites' behavior. And so this creates uncertainty as to who in the future will be doling out punishment and rewards. And so at such points, perhaps not surprisingly, and this isn't a particularly novel insight. Anyone who's studied politics, knows. I mean, moments of succession can breed crisis, and that's essentially what this logic is. So there start to be strong potential for these different groupings within the elite that had formerly competed for the president's favor to start competing much more openly to try and get control of presidential power. So if you think about presidential power as sort of a giant club that can be used to sort of beat the opposition, or maybe something that can be used to entice people to go along with you, right? One thing is you for sure don't want that club falling in the hand of your rival, because you can be sure that after that rival gets power, you're going to find yourself squeezed out. On the other hand, it could be tremendously beneficial if you get control of it yourself, because then you can drive out your rivals and exercise power for your own benefit. And one reason this takes place is because the presidency is essentially an indivisible good. Right? In the language of Al Stepan, it's there can only be one president. And so that tends to create very intense competition. So you get this situation where the incentives for struggling for this power become very high, and at the same time that the probability that you'll be punished for opposing the incumbent start to get lower because, well, maybe you'll succeed, and then you won't be punished if you break rank now. And I think it's this logic that leads us to, that helps explain why virtually all post-Soviet patronal presidents or super presidents that we've seen whose teams have fallen from power since the late 1990s, when the systems were just kind of congealing, have essentially been in this lame duck phase one way or the other. And this is not just limited to the color revolutions. So, if we just kind of go through a list, Petrosian in 1997-1998 was in his constitutionally final second term. Shevardnadze in Georgia in 2003 was in his constitutionally final second term, and not long before had announced that he was not going to run. I mean, that again, there are a lot of reasons to think that he wasn't in a position to. Kuchma, president of Ukraine, decided not to run for president in 2004. And these were all cases before, Petrosian was then effectively ousted in a sort of deft maneuver by his own prime minister. Shevardnadze then fell victim to the Rose Revolution. Kuchma, he lost power with his team in the Orange Revolution. And even if we look to such places as Abkhazia, which is a case that's not often considered in this regard, we find that the longtime president of Abkhazia, Vladislav Artzimba, in 2004 was very ill and himself did not run for re-election when they had presidents. And the person that he tried to hand off power to, Raul Hajimba, lost the election to the current president, Bagapsh. And interestingly, despite the fact that Putin was backing Hajimba. And so we often think about politics in places like Abkhazia as being very dependent on Russia. In fact, here we find a case where the incumbent team was overthrown even despite the fact that they had Russian backing, in an event that was very similar to some of these other revolutions involving street protests over an election. Askar Akayev in 2005 in Kyrgyzstan was also in his constitutionally final second term. And Kurmanbek Bakiev in 2010, who was overthrown in April, had successfully put down a number of rebellions during his first term, then entered into his second term, which is his final, constitutionally final one. And that, I would argue, not coincidentally, wound up being the time when he was overthrown, when the opposition finally was able to successfully overthrow him. And one other observation that's interesting is that the victors who vanquished these authoritarians almost all came from the elite. They generally were not the people that were leading student protests that eventually took power. It was Petrosian's prime minister Kocharyan who displaced him in the late 1990s. Saakashvili, current president of Georgia, the leading figure in the Rose Revolution, of course, had long time been a key member of Shevardnadze's team, including justice minister. Bagapsh, the current president of Abkhazia, who overthrew Artzimba, the Hajimba regime, had been prime minister under Artzimba until 1997. Yushchenko, president of Ukraine, the winner of the Orange Revolution, had been prime minister under Kuchma until 2001. Bakiev, who overthrew Akayev in Kyrgyzstan, had been Akayev's prime minister until 2002. And current president of Kyrgyzstan, Rosa Otunbayeva, of course, had been Bakiev's foreign minister. So, I think it's not coincidental. We're seeing we're seeing dynamics that have very important elite dynamics. And a lot of what's happening is that, as these moments of succession approach, it's often the members of the former elite who are defect and are able to create schisms in the regime, which lead to the regime's downfall. So I don't want to suggest, however, that it's only about elite dynamics. I think this is a crucial point. But if you think about it, I mean, what do these elites want? I mean, they want to wind up on the winning side, right? What you don't want to do is wind up on the losing side, because then you're punished and driven out and your resources can be taken away. So you want to be on the winning side. So to some extent, how do you win such a struggle? Well, a large part of it is convincing people that you will win, because once people think that you're the one that's going to win, they're going to start going over to your side. It kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so how do you convince people that you're going to win? Well, part of it is to use these administrative levers, the ability to punish and reward effectively. But also, an important weapon in this struggle is the cultivation and courting of true mass support. And mass support is important largely because the struggle for the presidency is ultimately decided by an official vote count in elections. And because of this, I would say mass support matters not so much because it actually generates a certain number of votes that winds up being greater than your opponents. What mass support helps you do is to convince other elites that you have an advantage, because it's more difficult to falsify an election against you the larger the number of supporters you have is. Mass mobilization on the street is costly to suppress. So the larger the protests are, the less likely it is that someone trying to suppress them is going to succeed. Mass mobilization, just the acts of protest itself, can also create the impression that the regime is unpopular or will lose. And so a lot of these struggles, but not all of them, involve mass mobilization. And in fact, I think all of these regimes, even the ones that haven't succumbed, pay a great deal of attention to public opinion. There's one analyst in Russia who dubbed Russia's regime, he called it a ratingocracy, because they pay so much attention to Putin's ratings in public opinion, recognizing, I think, that sustaining Putin's popularity is essential to the stability of Putin's regime. So there is a kind of important way in which public opinion influences the likelihood that these leaders are going to stay in power. And so if we look at the set of leaders who if we look at the set of leaders who went through a lame duck phase, right? Not all of them fell from power. But the ones that fell from power tended to be those that were the least popular. So Ardzimba, Kuchma, Shevardnadze, Akayev, Bakiev, Petrosyan, all at the time were generally seen as relatively decrepit and ineffective leaders. And in some cases, when successors were picked, such as Yanukovych in Ukraine, the current president, he wasn't regarded as a truly popular figure. He's a very divisive figure, and generally seen as corrupt and uncharismatic and had a criminal record, which really alienated a large part of the population. Plus he was tied to one particular clan in Ukraine, the Donetsk region. And if we contrast this with some of the leaders that stayed in power, Putin has maintained very high popularity since the fall of 1999 in Russia. And I think this has been a key reason why Putin was able to pull off the kind of two-step maneuver he did to get Medvedev into the presidency and to avoid the possibility of revolution breaking out there. Haydar Aliyev in Azerbaijan, didn't always generate huge enthusiasm among the population, but he was regarded as being a very authoritative and effective leader, and was able to help usher his son into the role of successor. And there I think the dynastic principle is also significant, because kind of there's a vision of some kind of continuity taking place between the transition of power between father and son, which can help stabilize elite dynamics during these transitions. So we could go on with some of the other cases, but what we find is that the regimes that sustain their popularity over time and remain in power then also start to take on sort of an air of invulnerability, an air of that their victory is inevitable, and that reinforces this whole expectation that they're likely to continue in power. And so I think that's a dynamic we see in Russia and Azerbaijan, an increasingly strong ability to survive. And so I think in some, if we look at what explains when leaders are overthrown in some countries and not others, we can focus on two main factors. One would be this lame duck syndrome, which I would define essentially as widespread expectations that an incumbent will leave office for one reason or other, be it term limits that have not been changed or self-withdrawal, and public opinion regarding incumbents and their designated successors. And kind of only after that do we get really these other causes, which are clearly influential, but leadership strategies, opposition strategies, international intervention, demonstration effects, contagion, things like that. I think kind of the combination of this unpopularity and vulnerability due to a lame duck syndrome kind of creates the opportunity for these other factors to matter. And so similarly, we find that the leaders of countries where presidents have never faced a lame duck syndrome or have not included any real opposition in elections since the late 1990s, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, have also not faced a serious revolutionary threat. And I would suggest that elites in such places are unlikely to defect and start mobilizing against the incumbent unless things get really, really bad. So kind of the larger point then is that revolutions to some extent can be seen as a normal part of the functioning of this sort of regime, which leads us to expect that when we get a revolution like this, there's going to be a strong tendency for the same dynamics to reemerge unless something else has changed. And typically, these revolutions don't change political culture. They don't eliminate the extensive clientelism in society. Certainly not in politics. And and if they retain the same constitutional structure as well, we can expect to see the same things afterwards. So. Again, in the interest of time, I won't go into all the reasons why I think that's the case, but I think empirically, we've seen this. So, we see that despite the hopes that people initially had in places like Georgia, that Saakashvili, Western-educated, widely regarded as a true believer in democracy, despite the expectations that he would pursue democracy, wound up using a lot of the same tools. And I think largely because they're available and they're very useful to him. It can be very tempting to try and use this presidency for good. But then once you start going down that road, before you know it, you start seeing a new closure of the political space. Similarly, Bakiev. I mean, a lot of people now say, well, Bakiev was clearly never a Democrat. But, you look at what was written about him at the time in 2005, and there's a lot more optimism about his motives. I mean, there were, major experts on Kyrgyzstan calling him a clean politician. But we wound up seeing something very different. So this leads to the final main question, which is how do true democratic breakthroughs happen in these countries? There are a number of possibilities. I don't want to rule, kind of anything out. I think, those of us who studied this part of the world realize it's probably foolish to rule anything out. One possibility that's been suggested is the possibility that, what we really need is strong democratic leaders who can impose democracy or lead a country in a democratic election. But again, I think the experience of Saakashvili and even Bakiev leads us to be skeptical of that. I mean, one hopes. I mean, one of the interesting things about Saakashvili, which we can talk about, is he has done certain other things. I mean, he's the only leader out of this set who seems to have actually done something to reduce the level of corruption and clientelism in these societies. Basically revolutionizing the traffic police is truly amazing. They don't stop you anymore for bribes, whereas it used to be a highly institutionalized bribe collection system. So it may be that in the end he winds up successfully changing the culture. I'm skeptical of that. I think it's, I think corruption of the system has essentially remained. So I'm not ruling out the fact that it may eventually be possible, but at the same